Good morning. Welcome to Connection, coming to you from Spirit and Truth Sanctuary. Happy Tuesday. Happy 1st of March. We are one step closer to spring. Speaking of the 1st of March, this is a very special day for me personally because it is my niece, Esther Paulk's 23rd birthday. So happy birthday, Esther. Also, I would like to let everybody know one thing before we get into our morning blessing. I spoke with Miss Megan Lynch last week. She has had knee replacement surgery. She's doing okay. I probably will go and visit her later on this week, but I'm sure that she would appreciate all of your thoughts and prayers and positive energy toward her. So happy birthday, Esther, and happy recovery, Miss Megan. Let's go to our morning blessing. Spirit of truth, we give thanks today for our connection in this time of togetherness, for our sameness as well as our contrasts, and for the light we reflect to one another and see in one another. We give thanks for the holy that holds us, and for the humanity that always brings us back to the holy. We ask that our happiness, our peace, and our joy now be woven into the fabric of the world around us, and that it serve as nourishment to feed the heart of the collective. In the name and nature of the Christ, amen, and so it is. All right, our first quote today is, "There is no other world. There's just another way to live." And that's by a man named Jacques, and his last name was actually, the end of it was cut off. All I got were the letters MESR. So whatever the last letters of his name are, that is by him. These next three quotes are all from Andrew Martin, who I quote a lot around here and who I'll be quoting quite a bit today. The first one is, "We are limitless beings who came to play in the fields of limitation." Next, "Your liberation is up to you." And lastly, "The only conditions you can control are internal. So if you want to make a change, start there." My teaching today is going to be a continuation of the idea I began talking about this past Sunday before the responsive reading. I had mentioned what's going on at the moment between Russia and the Ukraine, and one of my points was that even though we are all creators because we are made in the image and likeness of God, the ultimate creator, we can't change anyone else or create any change really outside of ourselves. And so that's where we all must start, with ourselves. I want to begin today with a piece by Amanda Ellis in which she also talks about this situation, and she has got some very deep insights, I think, as to why war is still going on this planet and what we, especially as spiritual people, can do about it, but more importantly, what we should not do, because it is just not helpful. So here are some excerpts from Amanda's video that she titled, "What Now?" She says, "Part of the world being at war, again, will affect us all personally in two ways. Some, it will send back into old patterns of wounding based in our own insecurities. In other words, it can make some of us feel very unsafe and uncertain and even frightened. Others of us, it will send into an exaggerated state of us against them. The lesson for humanity at the moment is shared coexistence, which is the opposite of invasion, war, and trying to take over. Now, whatever the reason you think this is happening doesn't really matter. It's beside the point, because it's just a reflection of what's going on everywhere, across the borders of other countries, and even on the individual streets of our neighborhoods. We've got to learn to share and coexist with each other peacefully, whether it's at a micro level, something between you and a neighbor or you and a family member, or on the macro level, war between nations. It's never easy. The question for us right now as a species is, can we coexist and share the Earth's resources without killing each other? What is happening on the macro level in the collective is just a reflection of what's going on within us as individuals on the micro level, because what the world is made up of is individuals and families, communities, groups, and countries. We are all part of what makes up that whole. When war breaks out on the macro level, people tend to go back to whatever is easiest for them to handle emotionally. And by far, the easiest narrative is us against them. We love to label someone as the aggressor and someone else as the victim. And in this particular case, some people have chosen to put the label of aggressor or villain or bad guy on Vladimir Putin. But it could very well be somebody else, anybody else. That's just the role he's cast in at the moment. In the past, it's been many other people. In the future, it will be others. Whether it's in the physical realm or you shift it to the spiritual, the easiest narrative is always that there's a good guy or good guys and bad guys. And as soon as the bad guys are dealt with and gone, all will be well again. But it's never that simple. Some people, when looking at this situation, are actually going in the opposite direction and casting Putin in the role of good guy, which just serves to prove the whole fallacy of the good against evil paradigm. There's never a clear good versus bad, because there are always going to be those who disagree with your particular perspective of the situation. This is one of the reasons that the us against them mentality is never productive and never truly resolves anything. Darkness exists in every single part of our world because it's in you and it's in me. And so until we cleanse our own darkness and our own shadow, first own it, then purge it. I like to use the word transmute here better. Until we bring our own darkness and light back into balance, we are always going to see outer manifestations of its imbalance in the wider world. Outer darkness, which includes war, is only there as a reflection of the inner work we still have not done as a species. That thought triggers a lot of people, which is why they just fall back into the us against them narrative. Because again, it's much easier to have someone else to blame. But what we need to understand is that the people on our planet who are carrying out these bad deeds are just playing a role. We are a planet of duality. We are a planet of both darkness and light. Because of this, there must be both a disruptor and a peacekeeper. And until we as the collective choose to stop playing these duality games, including war, war will continue to be a reality on our planet. Change has to start with us. All right, so this next part I just wanted to make clear is still her talking when she says I. She says, I put up a post this morning asking all who follow me to just send peace to both countries. And I asked specifically for there to be no arguments in the comments section about your personal beliefs about who started it and which side was right or wrong. And you couldn't do it. So I finally had to just switch off the ability for you to comment. We as a group on my Instagram page couldn't even agree just to send peace, love, and light and leave it at that. All right, so you see, she's proving her own point that she began with here, that there's still so much disagreement and finger pointing and blaming and arguing going on at the micro level, just between the relatively small group in comparison to the whole world of the few thousand people that follow her on Instagram. These few thousand people who obviously have enough in common to follow the same person on Instagram, they still can't even get along with each other. So, of course, that energy is also going to be reflected out in the macro level, which is what she's saying. So, and she also makes the point, and I thought was interesting, she specifically asked them, don't argue. And they couldn't help themselves. They just did it anyway, all right? So, countries, when countries go to war, what are countries made up of? Countries are made up of us, of these individuals who can't get along with each other on Instagram. So no wonder there is literal war breaking out. Okay, So listen to what she says next. It's very important and similar to what our responsive reading was about on Sunday, the fact that we are all powerful creators. Again, that's not just something we say, it's true. So, what is it we're creating? Back to Amanda. If we're sitting around focusing our thoughts on the fact that something awful in the world is about to happen, we're helping to manifest that thing. We are all powerful manifestors. We can manifest light, but we can also manifest darkness without even realizing that's what we're doing by focusing on the lower vibrations of what's going on or has the potential to go on in the world. We must all be brave enough to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, I see my darkness. I see my shadow. Labeling external events as good or evil is meaningless until we are all able to look within ourselves and see that both are present. And the one that we feed the most is the one that's going to get bigger and continue on. So are we feeding the peace within or the battle and conflict? It's all about what we do and what we say to each other and to ourselves. Are you at war with yourself or are you at peace within? Are you at war with your neighbor or with that person who just made a comment you don't agree with? All of this contributes to the angst and hostility that's present in our world right now. But if each of us can recognize this, see the darkness within ourselves, and begin to purge it on the micro level, again, I would choose to use the word transmute it, then that's when we begin to tip the balance in our external world. But we don't often do that because we don't want to look at ourselves that closely or accept the fact that our actions are a contributing factor, and because it's easier to blame them, whoever they are. Okay, time out. Just like you Christian folks out there, it's always easier to blame the devil than to admit you created that mess that you're in. Okay, back to Amanda. But it's too easy just to blame them, and that's why the wars are still happening, because we have still not done our own inner work. Where does that begin? It begins with every single word that we utter, with every thought that we think, with every action we take, because these things build either the monsters in our midst or the angels. I love that. So thank you, Amanda. Again, just reinforcing the truth that we create our own reality on all levels, micro and macro, as well as individual and collective. I want to shift now to Christina Lopes and some information from her that I gave you last year, in which she's talking again about this us versus them mentality being a trap that you can fall into, especially during a spiritual awakening. And here she explains that all that is unchecked ego. And then she describes a better way to look at why the world is as it is and who is responsible for it. I'm reading from her piece now called The Dark Side of Spirituality. And it's in the context of what can sometimes happen when a person, or in this case, the entire world, is going through a spiritual awakening, which I believe is what is happening at present. She says most people believe a spiritual awakening and spirituality in general is all love and light. But there is a darker side full of some common traps people fall into, especially at the beginning of their spiritual journey. The first one is an us versus them mentality. This happens if someone awakens spiritually but somehow remains in separation consciousness. This is largely the result of not appropriately dealing with your ego. Your ego likes to see the world in terms of us versus them, or me versus another person, or me plus my small circle of like-minded friends versus the rest of the world. When you genuinely awaken and you deal with your ego, you are not in separation consciousness, because you understand and come into the concept of unity consciousness and realize on a deep level that we are all connected and that we are all one. But when your ego is left in place unchecked, spiritual awakening can manifest itself like this, with people talking about certain other people or certain other groups of people other than the group that they're with as bad or evil. In a very real sense, there's no such thing as you versus anything or anyone else. The core reality is that we are all connected. The most common example of someone falling into this trap is when they begin to believe that the world is dominated by a small group of rich people for whom there are different names: the New World Order, the elites, the Illuminati, who are pulling the strings and controlling the world events to which the rest of us are subject. This is a really common belief within some spiritual circles, but it's just a manifestation of the old ego-driven us versus them, separation consciousness mentality. This belief has two components that are important to understand. The first is victim consciousness. Many times, even after spiritually awakening, people don't realize they are still in victim consciousness. When you hold a belief like this, that the entire world is dominated by a small group of people, you are in essence saying that you also believe everyone not in that group are victims of the group and whatever they choose to do. The more you allow yourself to remain in this type of victim consciousness, the more powerless you will feel and be. The second component of this belief is the rejection of responsibility. If I say that there's this group of people who are dominating the world, I'm basically letting go of any personal responsibility for my part in the co-creation process. The world is the way it is because of the individual contributions of the 7.8 billion people in it. Each of us makes choices every day that contribute to the collective reality. All right, so this is exactly what Amanda Ellis just said. What we think, say, and do creates either monsters or angels in our world on both the micro and macro level. The minute I point my finger and say it's that person's fault, I'm throwing all the responsibility onto them. Always remember that on a spiritual level, there is no such thing as us and them. The collective consciousness and our shared reality is a product of all of us. A good mantra to remember to repeat when you realize you're falling into this trap is, reality is a collective co-creation. When we believe anything other than this, it is the result of spiritual laziness. Again, just as Amanda said, it's easier to just blame someone else than to look inside. It's easier to reject personal responsibility and remain in victim consciousness, but it's also an abdication of our personal power. If there are things out there that we would like to see change, we must first change ourselves and come into our personal power. We can change nothing from a position of powerlessness. So, how do we do that? How do we begin to shift from a powerless position where we're the victim to a powerful position of where we are the creator? Well, first we've got to, as both Amanda and Christina have suggested, look at ourselves, specifically our shadow. Deal with it, recognize it, admit that we have a shadow side, and then purge or transmute it. A woman named Debbie Ford offers some advice on how to do this. She says, and she's talking here about how to recognize your shadow. The first step is to look at your life and see where you're struggling. The places in your life where you feel you don't have it all together and everything is not as you want it to be, or where you're always trying to be different than you are, but you keep showing up the same way time after time, and you keep having the same issues. Then you know that's a place where there's a shadow lurking. Again, it's the same on both the micro and the macro. Why do we keep going to war with each other? Similar question. The shadow, she says, helps us learn how to love, because anything that we judge in another is part of our shadow. When we think of it that way, we can begin to say, how can I be kind to that part of me? Just like we ask ourselves, how can we be kind to others who need our kindness when they're not behaving as their best selves? As humans living in this dualistic existence, we are both the saint and the sinner, the divine and the diabolical. We are filled with and made up of both the light and the dark. As humans, we couldn't know light without darkness. We wouldn't recognize kindness if we'd never experienced meanness. We wouldn't know what it is to be selfless if we didn't understand and acknowledge what selfishness is. And that recognition of, acknowledgement of, and then the embracing of the shadow teaches us true love, because it's easy to love when you feel good and everybody's behaving like you want them to, and you have enough money, and you think you look good, and everything's going your way. But how do you love when you've been hurt, when you've been betrayed, or when you feel you failed at something? That's real love, and that's what the shadow effect teaches us to do. Love in those moments is when it is most difficult. If indeed we are each a microcosm of the macrocosm, meaning we are each a piece of the whole, then our job as individuals is to begin by loving that piece of the whole that we are. We must each love all that we are and embrace our angry self, our mean self, our vindictive self, our selfish self, as well as our loving self, our peaceful self, our generous self, and our abundant self. When we take responsibility for all our different selves, then we'll start to be different humans and will show up differently as our piece of the whole, which will eventually change all of the whole. We'll stop throwing our shadows onto other people. We talked just last week, I think, about projecting. And we'll stop telling our children, don't be this, don't be that, don't be mean, don't be angry. Because all those don't be's makes them believe they're not okay, that they're not good enough, that there's something wrong with them. All this does is cause them to hide that part of themselves in the shadow and not be able to deliver their authentic selves along with all their gifts and talents to the world. All that does is teach them that it's okay to fragment themselves. Ultimately, we are on this earth to learn to love, and not just the good parts, but all of who we are. For more of that, all I can do is direct you to our Wednesday night teaching right now, which is the book by Brene Brown, The Gifts of Our Imperfections. That is exactly what the entire book is about. Embracing and loving and accepting all of who we are, not just the parts that we find pretty or that we think will please others. All right, so we see a theme emerging among all these different spiritual teachers I've been reading from who are basically saying the same thing. It's easier to blame some nebulous them than to take our part of the responsibility for creating what's going on, for having created what's going on. And it's also easier to get caught up in following what's going on out there on the macro level than to deal with our own stuff. It's easier to stay glued to CNN and share your opinions about what's happening out there online or at the dinner table than to look inside and start fixing you. But guess what? That's the only thing you can actually fix or change. Your comment under a Facebook post is going to do very little to change what's happening in Russia. But using that same time and energy to change something about yourself could make a much bigger difference than you think it will. Let's go now to Andrew Martin and see what he has to say about it. This is from a piece that he posted just yesterday called Finding Light in the Darkness, Guidance for Our Troubling Times. He begins with this question: how do we hold our light when we see so much tragedy in the world around us? And then he answers like this: nature shows us both the light and the dark. The shadow and the light are present in all things. Fire can cook our food and keep us warm, and it can also destroy everything. Water is the source of all life, but a flood of it can flatten a village. The same thing is true of earth. We plant seeds in it and it gives us food, but it can also bury us under a landslide. So this idea that things are or can be separate from one another is a fallacy. Light alone is like a flat white wall. Okay, I'm going to add here, it's also blinding. If all you ever see is white, have you ever heard of people talk about snow blindness, that there's just so much white that it's reflecting all the sunlight and they can't see anything? All right, so he says light all by itself is just like a flat white wall. But darkness alone is an endless void of nothingness. And I'm going to add here as well, this is blinding in another way, in that you can't see anything if everything is dark. So too much light and not enough light, which is what the darkness is, both result in the same situation of not being able to properly see. Okay, back to Andrew Martin. He says, we must have both. Okay, I want to stop right here and give you a little visual to demonstrate what I think he's saying. We've been talking about ourselves as creators, right? So let's think about it in terms of us creating a piece of art, or even something as simple as writing a letter, some form of communication. You start with a white canvas or a blank white sheet of paper. Let's say that represents the light. Okay, if you use white paint on a white canvas or white ink on white paper, you're not going to be able to see it. You're not going to be able to create anything that will be of any use to anyone. You have to have black ink, or any other color really. You have to have a color of paint that is different than white, that provides a contrast, okay, to the light in order to create something that others will be able to see or read. That's what the darkness is. It provides the contrast to the light, without which there is no creation. Back to Andrew. So here he's talking about standing against the darkness, which is not quite the same thing as fighting against or resisting. It's a subtle difference in language, but it's a big one in attitude. I taught on that a long time ago, and we might revisit that topic next week. But fighting against and resisting only holds something in place or creates more of it. But standing in the face of something or standing up to something is a different concept, even though they might sound very similar. Listen to what he says here. In the natural, when we see the darkness approaching, like big black clouds rolling in, our tendency is often to run and hide, to try to find safety for ourselves. But in the spiritual sense, we must move toward the darkness with our light, stand against it, stand up and say, I will not be moved. Also, we must understand that our suffering in times of darkness does nothing to make anything or anyone better. My sadness and misery and disconnection from my own center is often what those who perpetrate the dark want me to do. They want me to forget my light. Excuse me. Now, let me stop here for just a minute and make a few comments about this. I know that last little bit sounded a lot like the us against them mentality that I was just talking about. That is a trap that we shouldn't fall into. But I think that's just a consequence of the limitations of the language he's trying to use here to describe this. When he says they, I don't think he's referring to a specific person or people as in the bad guys, whoever they may be in any given situation. However, there is an energy present in darkness. And although we shouldn't necessarily attach names and faces to it or put all the blame on it, we need to be aware of it. Let me give you an example. I was watching a news show yesterday, and a woman was reporting on all the incidences on social media lately surrounding this conflict between Russia and Ukraine that had been fabricated. People were actually out there posting photos, for instance, of like dead soldiers claiming that they were Ukrainians, and it was later proven that the pictures were from years ago during a different war entirely. Another showed footage of a raging fire, stating that it was the result of a bombing that had taken place in Kiev or Kyiv. I'm not sure if that's even the same city. They seem to be pronouncing it two different ways on the news. But it turns out that the footage was not from a bomb that had exploded anywhere in the Ukraine. It was really from a chemical explosion that had happened in 2015 in China. It wasn't even in Ukraine. Another was of a woman standing in front of her crumbling house with a caption reading, "The current devastation in Ukraine," which was later proven to be a years-old photo that had nothing to do with war at all. Lastly, and most unbelievably, an Italian newscast used footage from a video game showing a horrifying rain of missile fire that wasn't real at all in any sense. So, what's my point in telling you all that? I don't know who's doing that kind of stuff or why. There are probably a variety of reasons. Each person or news outlet, no doubt, has their own agenda. Maybe they want to raise money, or maybe they're just using this as clickbait to get more traffic on their website. Maybe a few are nefarious. But the point is, no matter what their agenda is, if you fall for it and see these images, believe they are real, and let them upset you and pull you off your center of balance, if you let them make you sad or outraged or scared, then all that does is lower your vibration. And when enough people are being affected in the same way, all it does is bring down the vibration of the entire collective. Remember what Andrew just said. Our suffering in times of darkness does nothing to make anything or anyone better. My sadness and misery and disconnection from my center only feeds into the darkness and creates more of it. And that is what they, speaking of the people who are, as he put it, perpetrating the darkness, want. It's only serving these people's agenda, whatever that agenda is. And it's probably not one great big worldwide evil conspiracy, as Christina Lopes was talking about, that some people believe in. But the little bit of darkness, it's probably just the little bit of darkness or selfishness or greed that's in each of these people, who each have an individual agenda and are manipulating your emotions for their own personal gain. So when we stay glued to the bad news 24/7, that's what we're feeding into and creating more of. And what's really going on is bad enough, without having to wade through all of the manufactured material that's not even true. So let's be smarter than that. Back to Andrew. In the face of atrocities such as war, remember that you leaving your center of well-being serves nobody, and that the most powerful thing you have is a response that comes from your heart, from your light, which incidentally is why you need to protect your heart and your light and your emotions, and not allow yourself to get worked up over all of this fake news. I wish that a certain person had not co-opted that word, because now every time anyone says it, that's what they think of. But there actually is fake news out there, and these are some examples of it that I just gave you. Andrew says, tell yourself, I will not meet trauma with trauma. I will not meet fear with fear. I will meet it all with love. And when you forget how to do that, that's a sign that you need to stop, turn off the TV and the computer, put your phone down, and go outside and connect with nature. Wherever you need to go and whatever you need to do to recenter yourself in your light and in your power. And then you ask, what can I do? How can I serve? And when you ask that, make sure you're asking from your heart, because the intellect only knows things historically, and that is its limitation. The intellect can only know what has already happened. It is not the visionary part of you. The visionary is the intuitive feeling center. We often try to put the intellect in charge of solving these major world problems: oppression, violence, chaos, racism, trashing the planet, and war. But if the intellect were the solution, we would not be where we are. When we use the intellect alone, all we're thinking of is, how do I fix this? And we're looking to history to find that answer. And if all we've got to look at is history, then all we have access to is the broken pieces of the thing that's already not working. So we're trying to rebuild something out of broken parts. that's never going to work. The only answer is to go into a deeper part of ourselves to find something new. Okay, I want you to remember that he said that. We're going to talk about that more at the end of the teaching. So he's saying we've been using our intellect, our heads, our minds to try to solve these problems for centuries now, and it hasn't worked. So we have to look in a new place. And it's also interesting that he said we must go deeper into ourselves to find the answer, not outside ourselves, because we've already tried that too. Listen to what he says here. He's talking about everyone who just wants God to handle it. The people who think that the only solution is divine intervention. And if we just pray hard enough, it would all stop. He tells you why that won't work either. He says, when people ask, why would God allow this to happen? Why doesn't the divine just come down and say it's done and make it all better? The answer is because the only way humans learn is through their own understanding. We only learn through our physical experience. So even if God suddenly waved a wand and there was instantly peace on the planet, the ideas that create war and violence won't have gone anywhere. They would all still be right here. Time out. That's why we have to deal with the ideas, not the actual action of war. The divine says to us, you can have anything you want, but you must choose it first. We can't go 2 minutes on this planet without calling for the death of someone. Okay, time out. Remember what we talked about earlier when I was relaying the story about Amanda Ellis having shut down her whole comment section on Instagram because after she had specifically asked her followers not to argue under a post, they did it anyway. Okay, so again, there's no point in what he's saying is if God came down and did it, we're still here and all this stuff is still in us, so it's just going to come right back out. Again, he says, God could stop every war on the planet this afternoon, and by morning, we'd mess it up, and someone somewhere would be fighting again. We must find the seeds of what we want for the world within ourselves first. As within, so without. Because we have to be at the frequency of love in order to manifest it. We can't get to love and peace from anger and misery. So let's choose light. Let's choose love. Let's choose forgiveness and compassion. And don't worry if you think that seems insignificant and small in comparison to the problems that need to be solved. If the only thing you can do is remember your light, that's where you start. You start by asking, where is my light today? Where is my peace and my power right now? Okay, remember what I said on Sunday? God, I'll help whoever you put directly in my path to the best of my ability, and I won't worry about the rest of it. I'll just leave that up to you. You start by finding that, he's talking about your power and your peace, and showing it in small ways at first, and it becomes the ember that you gently blow upon until it becomes a raging inferno within you. And then you can ask, okay, Spirit, how can I move the mark in the world? But that must begin by moving the mark within yourself, because how we treat ourselves is how we treat the world. I want to close today with parts of a very inspirational speech, which I'm sure I will not do proper justice to, from a television series of all things. And this series just so happens to have been filmed in our old cathedral. It was a show called Greenleaf. And I want to talk a minute here and thank a very dear friend of mine, Jonathan Ford Turnbull, because I hadn't watched that last season of that show because, frankly, parts of it were just too close to home. And I know many of you know what I'm talking about. And it was just too strange for me to see other people in the building that I had spent so much of my life in. But he and I were texting one night, and he said, oh, you have to watch the final season, especially the last episode. It's very powerful. And he had no way of knowing about a particular situation that was going on in my life at the time because I hadn't told him. But he really encouraged me to watch it, so I did. And it was exactly what I needed to hear at that moment. So thank you, Jonathan. And now it's going to help everybody because I knew when I watched it that at some point it would find its way into one of my teachings, and today is that day. It's actually a part of a eulogy that a wife was giving for her husband, the late bishop of the church, and I want you to listen to it today in the context of what we've been talking about. We know the old way the world has been trying to run itself isn't working anymore. Our old ways of war and violence are not solving anything. What we need is a new world. But as our first quote said today, there is no other world. There's just another way to live. And that way is learning that everything starts within us. It all comes from the inside out. And so if we want to create a new world, there's just one prayer we need to pray. Make me new. Because all of us me's make up the world. So here in the words of the fictional First Lady May Greenleaf is my closing for today. She's speaking specifically to her husband's congregation, and so she refers to a new church. But I'm going to take advantage of poetic license here and replace the word church with the word world, because that's what we've been talking about today. She sets it up by telling the congregation that she has asked her husband, who has already made his transition, what she should say at his funeral, and he said, "May, tell them something new." And then she continues, "I want to talk about the new. Behold, the prophet Isaiah said, speaking for God, I am doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it?" And so today, I want us to think together about the new. I want us to dream together about the new. Not what this world has been, but what it's never been before. What we can't even imagine a world to be. I stand here before you at the edge of infinity with no ideas and no plans, with my arms and my heart and my mind open. And I am saying, "Oh Lord Jesus, make me new. Show me forgiveness where there can be none, redemption when it's far too late, water where the well long ago ran dry, acceptance where there is hate. Show me what I can't explain. Make me what I don't think I can be. Make me new." Let us learn to love our past enough to let it go and move forward into the future. And then she has the entire congregation repeat with her in unison, which I will ask you to do now wherever you are sitting. Make me new. And that's it. That's how we make a new world. By each of us asking for help and guidance and then doing the inner work that it takes to make ourselves new. So if you want to see wars come to an end, and if you want to be a part of creating a new earth, stop focusing on anything external and start making yourself new. Amen? Amen. Please join us tomorrow night at 6:30 for the continuing series. I think we are. It's also Ash Wednesday, so we will be taking communion as well. I believe we'll be talking about the series. If we're not, it is Ash Wednesday. It might be a special service. Regardless, it's going to be wonderful. 6:30 tomorrow night, and then we will also see you again on Sunday. I love you. Have a great week. Be at peace.